Okay, thank you very much for joining today's exciting debates. The motion before this round is how to select politicians at random from currently eligible adults. Without much further ado, I call the Prime Minister to open the case. Here. So I will clap my hand when the first 1 minute, and also I clap hands when it is 6 minutes, and I will clap hands twice when it is 7 minutes.
I will take POI around 4 minutes. Others, you might suppose that representative democracy is a good concept because people can select representative and representative can work as a citizen, work for the sake of citizen. But the premise of representative democracy is every person is able to choose the appropriate representative, and this representative can dedicate themselves to fulfill the mandates. As long as politician or political party is bound of any other actor, any other powers such as media or such as big corporation, and people will be empathy given that one vote do not have such a power to change the policy. We think it's better for citizens to directly chosen as a politician and make decisions against the decision of the country's future with which to propose this motion. 3 things like this. Firstly, a couple of framing how this vote with politician look like. Secondly, I'm going to explain the problem about misrepresentation, and lastly, the political education. My partner will explain the accountability of politics, and that's his job. Firstly, the framing. Prior to my construction, I will illustrate how the vote with politician looks like. There are 4 points. First, we will abolish all elections and election campaigns and political broadcasts, and we will hold parliament which consists of ordinary citizens who have not necessarily bound up with any other external power. Second, the independent organization will choose who to be politicians, for example, by using ID, and this process is irrefutable unless these people have reasonable accommodation. Thirdly, there are no president in the parliament in a war with solution. Someone will analyze the discussion of the decision-making processes is going to be majoritarianism, and this politician needs to choose among the 3 options. First, agree, or second, disagree, and thirdly, whatever. Lastly, parliament will be able to be dissolved with a majority consensus if the majority politicians of the solution believe that this parliament should be dissolved within this process, it's going to be respected, and other rules is going to be followed in the system of representative society in the past. Secondly, misrepresentation, a problem of misrepresentation. Opposition may talk about the principle of representation is good enough in a representative democracy, but the misrepresentation principle is nothing under the law with representative democracy. Politicians in the other side superficially aligns the manifest with very abstract law, with very non-strategical way. The majority of manifest politicians aligns in the election campaign in the opposition bench that remains to be answered to begin with. There are 2 reasons why. Firstly, the politician incentive is vote seeker. Therefore, what the politician is going to dedicate is all the politician is going to dedicate the election campaign in the first place. Therefore, even after the politician is going to be elected, these people have no incentive to respect the voices of majority manifest their lives. This is typically problem. This will be typically harmful when coalition government as one party is dominating the country. Because, for example, in cases of Japanese political system, the LDP is dominating this parliament in Japan. Therefore, even LDP has made a mistake, this LDP is going to be elected as a next election. Therefore, given the incentive for the politicians to seek a vote, and this position is supported largely by the citizens, we think these politicians have no incentive to reflect the manifest. What they're going to do is to reflect on what this politician is going to do is to get a vote from the ordinary citizen, and these people no incentive to respect the manifest. Second, Big corporations or media are bound up the political dimension under their circumstance. Media control the politician, and the politician control the media. A big company pays lot of money as a political donation to political party. Therefore, these people are influential to the decision of the political parties. Therefore, these people easily change their option, which is familiar to rich people or big corporation. For example, tax reduction or corporation. We think as long as this power exists, representation of the political party is now toxic. Yes.
When people are untrained for the particular political position they are being elected into by random, what suddenly about this process gives them the necessary training to actively make decisions about things like global health or things like politics or war?
Maybe you made a mistake. The politician should not be a professional. We think bureaucrats should be a professional. You need to explain why politicians should be charismatic and professional. This is the burden of opposition page. Continue my first argument, representation. In the world with representative democracy, in the world with politicians, those who decide how a country's decision is ordinary citizens. Therefore, in that side of the house, typically minority representation is going to be successful rather than that side of the house. If the 30% of the people are black people, the 30% of black people with a politician in that side of the house, these people can directly voice out in the parliament and explain that why minorities' right is not mutually exclusive the interest of the majority people. This is why in that side of the house, these people can voice out in an easier way. We think these people's representation is going to be successful rather than that side of the house. The impact is simple. The value of democracy is not a utilitarianistic calculation to begin with. As long as people deserve to decide the future of the country, I think this choice should be respected, even if it is not utilitarian variable. We think this is the principle of democracy. We should regard this as a good value. Second argument, participation. In the world with representative democracy, political apathy is frequently. There are two reasons why. Firstly, in the world with the right to vote, people believe one people's vote is not enough to change the political parties. Therefore, current Japanese people is giving up to go voting because LDP is dominating the country. Second, politicians' incentive is to hide the fact that we are supporting the minority people. Therefore, these people are superficially supporting the minority people. Therefore, minority people believe that I am supported by politicians. Therefore, these people are losing the way to go and losing the incentive to go voting and change the society. How in the side of us political apathy will be solved? In a world with solution, we will see the bottom-up change and social discourse change. The bottom-up change. The narrative in the world with solution. You are eligible as a politician. You have a chance to be elected as a politician. Therefore, educational institutions or other social movement is going to focus that you are going to be responsible. Therefore, you should know, or you should inform, and you should be informed a lot of choices or a lot of information. We think that this is the unique changes in our cycle. This will change the social discourse as a whole. If your neighbors is going to be elected as a politician, what you're going to do is to influence the other people to inform lots of information to your neighbors. I think social discourse uniquely changes in that side. That's beneficial. We can encourage participation on this. We're back to propose.
Thank you very much for your speech. Now, I welcome the leader of the opposition to open the case of the opposition page within 7 minutes. Thank you.
I get the time. Yeah. we are proud to oppose selecting politicians at random from currently eligible adults. So in this speech, I'm first going to define some of the parameters of the motion so we have an understanding of what this debate is about. I'm then going to move on to some framing for how you should evaluate the round. I'm going to give you our points of positive matter and then finally conclude with some rebuttal regarding the previous speech. So first and foremost, we need to talk about who the House is. Who would be randomly selecting these politicians? We think it's not particularly important which government we're talking about. It could be Japan, it could be the United States, it could be all of them, but it's important to think of one government as centralized. So it doesn't matter which country because they share a lot of the same issues, but we should be thinking the House as a specific federal or state government. So politicians are any elected official right now in a position of government. This relates to politics, people like the president, prime ministers, ministers of state, local politicians, or people working for federal agencies like the central bank or environmental agencies. As for eligibility, I think that we don't have anything we disagree on. These eligible adults mean we're not going to elect children, for example, to be our politicians, but of anyone that could run for office, that group would be randomly selected. We think it's also important to clarify that when we're talking about selection, this means that their appointment is random too. The government can't propose that the selection of all politicians is random and that the appointments to specific roles is not random. The whole thing needs to be random to stay true to the motion and ensure competitive equity for both sides. So that means each position is randomly selected. The prime minister is randomly selected and appointed, the city mayor is randomly selected and appointed, etc. The role of the opposition in this debate is not to advocate for random selection, but to advocate for democratic elections, which is directly contesting with what the government says. So, some framing for the round. We think that you should prioritize performance of these politicians as an impact to evaluate the round. Your role as a judge is to adopt a framework of consequentialism. So, consequentialism is an ethical theory that judges whether or not something is right by what its consequences or what its effects are. For instance, some people would say that lying is wrong, but if telling a lie will help save a person's life, then consequentialism says it's the right thing to do. So in the context of this debate, you should ask yourself, what is the material result of implementing the motion? Don't focus on intentions or theories like democracy as a principle. Look at the impacts in the end, and we will prove why selecting politicians at random hurts performance and harms citizens the most. That brings me to our 2 points of positive matter. The first is desire, and the second is expertise. So on desire, only people who want to run for office should be chosen. There are people who do not want to engage in politics or running for political office. They either don't care about politics, or maybe they do, but not to a large enough extent. Would you want a fireman who doesn't want to be a fireman? Ask yourself, would you want to receive care from a doctor who did not want to be a doctor? The desire and the passion is what motivates talent in these situations. Professional tennis players all like tennis, and that motivates them to be good at it from a young age. Nyla and I don't care that much about tennis. We don't really play, we don't really practice. And that's why we would not be good on a professional tennis team. So if you choose someone who didn't want to be there, then you should not expect them to perform well once they're there. And these people who don't care now will not care after appointment. The drive to go into politics and create change through that institution doesn't magically appear after random selection. Those people will still be unmotivated and just try to slide by because they didn't choose that path. They didn't choose to be good at it. They were given it, they were appointed, they were randomly selected the way that a parent gives their child household chores. In a second. The impact of this is performance. Performance has a huge effect on well-being for the country and its citizens. Politics requires huge decisions. The economy, healthcare, national security. These are important issues that massively affect people's lives and well-being. And making the right decision for them is imperative. Otherwise, you risk harm, poverty, war, environmental destruction, poor quality of life, and even death. And with that, I'll take the POI.
One of the reasons you are becoming politically apathetic is people are giving up go voting because low votes have less power than the politician is. And the other side of the house, education institutions go to support the narrative that you all are responsible to be elected as a potential politician. Please engage the proposition's important analysis.
I think that because time is finite, you can't train everyone to be good at this, right? Because not everyone is going to be a politician throughout their lifetimes. You're still going to have people that are going to school to be a doctor, someone that still wants to be a fireman, someone that wants to be an anthropology professor. And you can't expect them to simultaneously do that and train for whatever appointment they might be. You might appoint them prime minister, you might appoint them to the central bank, you might appoint them to lead healthcare or national security. You can't expect everyone to be an expert on everything. And because there's only so many hours in a day, I don't think that they could be good at it. I'm going to move to our second point of positive matter on expertise. All government systems are laden with multiple layers of bureaucracy and technicalities. All politicians must and should have some kind of familiarity. And only people who actively volunteer themselves to run for office usually show that they have expertise. And voting for them via election shows that there is some kind of expertise from them because they've determined that they have that necessary amount of knowledge. Sector-specific offices like the Bureau of Land Management, Transportation, environmental agencies, and even healthcare political services need to have people with expertise in them. Otherwise, people are making very important decisions about where to put nuclear reactors without knowing how close to the water they need to be for nuclear plants to cool. Or people who are making decisions about vaccination and health mandates without even being in a college freshman biology class. The impact is that this increases danger in unsafe regulations. It causes a breakdown in systems and potentially fatal consequences in those systems. For instance, if there's someone who's elected to political office when they're in charge of military operations, nuclear weapons, and the strategy of building those, but they have no idea how these weapons are made, they have no idea who the major player are or what the classified information is, they wouldn't be able to make informed decisions about these huge events. And you can't expect people to play catch up. That stability of a career is particularly key for ensuring expertise is specific to the industry that they are in. This will preempt their argument that people can learn once they're in office. Everyone gets training before the job. Doctors go to school for nearly a decade before they can practice. Economists, healthcare experts, environmental experts all train for most of their lives before being able to serve their country, which means they can never achieve that same level of expertise and they cannot protect their country adequately. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your speech. Now I welcome the member of the opposition to continue the government, member of the governments, the government space, so the 7 minutes. Thank you.
声大きいので、ごめんなさい。はい、大丈夫です。話します。ちょっと話します。これぐらいがちょうどいい。これぐらい。いや、どうせ喋ってくるから。そうね。OK。So, opposition may focus on the constitutional reason. The quality of policy or the performance is important because under in our state house, the lack of they mentioned the lack of because of the lack of the desire and the passion and the lack of the knowledge, expertise, or we fail to the quality of the policy, fail to the better quality of policy and better performance in the politician. So we deny the premise of the lack of desire, or we deny the premise of the lack of knowledge, expertise. So that's why, so we try to stand here. So I'm going to talk about 2 things in my speech. First of all, the quality policy, which finds better. The second of all, the participation. I extended the point as why the participation is significantly important. Why we can achieve the better participation. So all of this is integrated in my speech. So first of all, the quality of policy, right? the political policy. So they mention about student doesn't have an incentive and the passion to care about policy because they don't have to choose the occupation voluntary in the pathway. So we say the government side in our state of the house is that they have a massive incentive to be a politician. Why the two? In our state of the house, the system are in this society, right? So on the occasions, the students have a massive incentive to receive the fact that they become the politician as their beginning, right? So I will give an example here. There are, for example, the early section the model in this Singapore, right? So without their own will, they pass it's already distributed based on their grade in Singapore. So on that case, they distribute it as the beginning, right? They focus on the career path as a politician or soldiers, right? So that is why after they say they have a massive incentive to be a politician. So second of all, they measure about their democracy will be collapse or such kind of things, right? So even if that's true, so we say that why they don't apply to the democracy in the pathway, right? So I think so. Sorry, second of all, they mention about the lack of knowledge is significantly matter, right? So two responses here. Number one, that it is not matter, right? So we say we don't deny the single issue politician or so right? For example, if you were so majoring the national defense in the society, so you should focus on this kind of national security after they become a politician, right? So on the occasion, if the agriculture or nuclear power plant or this kind of party, or even the party with people who support the breaking down the NHK in Japan or this kind of things, or these kind of things, even if the single issue politician is admitted in our state of the house, right? So that is why this is not a problem, right? So and also these kind of people also already declare the LGBTQ matter or LGBTQ marriage or these kind of other things in the pathway. So on the occasion, lack of knowledge is not matter in the pathway. Two, even if it doesn't matter, so we say that we can in our side of the house, we can the politician can get the advice by the LGBT experts. For example, if we want to get the knowledge about the science, then you can listen to the science, listen to the voice or from scientific expert or these kind of things, right? In the pathway, right? So I will take a POI, yes.
Thank you. So you saying that if there's something like national security, you would get someone who's good at that to focus on that after they've been randomly selected. How many positions are there in government that would then have to be chosen who gets to do what, and who would make the decision after they're randomly selected of who gets to do what?
So of course, after we elect select the other, so we can depend on the certain kind of politician who are interested in the national security or these kind of things, right? So in the conference, after they make the consensus within the national conference or these kind of things, right? So that is why even in our state of the house we can guarantee the national defense in the first place. So okay, even in the state of the house, the under status quo, the Japanese self-defense force, this kind of the group is not expert in the first place, right? So on the occasion, it's not the workability on the creativity or on the national security is not defined in both sides of the house in the first place, right? So accountability. So third word, accountability. So rational election of the policy or the political policy, why we can achieve. Right. So three reasons here. So number one, the company have a more incentive to check the government, right? So because they are definition of profit seeker, the company always feel their influence from the politician. So the company doesn't know who is the politician. So on the occasion, they are massive incentive to focus on the government system. Two, the political organization is hard to be done because the specific the people, the less likely to be politician, the A or the vast majority people poor, previous people are minority, right? So on the occasion, specifically previous people are less likely to be politicians. They have a less power of the connection. So for example, as my personal career was present on the LDP or connection or these kind of things in our in the house, right? So on the occasion, the political lobbying is hard to be done. So third of all, the hegemonic media will report the current affairs in the more good way in our state of the house. It's more why? So we can more take the educational function because the more interpretation, for example, the economics of these kind of people are the common, the educational institution will be more report the more in good way or in so forth, right? So on the occasion it is better, right? So finally, I'm going to talk about briefly the participation extension. So the extension of the participation. So even if that is true, the opposition side true. It's the obligation to participation in democracy is the kind of such as the jury system or these kind of things is the way applied under status quo, right? So why that's variable? Then we can get the agency or to the happiness from the society. So for example, the medical system or these kind of things. So on the occasion, we have an obligation to participate in these kind of circumstances, right? So also they didn't mention about the minority case. They didn't engage in our case. So you should provide more alternative and so forth, right? Bradley, Robert, thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech. Now, I welcome the member of the opposition to continue the opposition case within 2 minutes.
Okay. When people who have not graduated high school are suddenly in charge of things like the economy, military weapons, and the environment, we think that the government is putting all of our lives into very clumsy hands. Very proud to oppose two things in this speech. First, I'm going to be answering their possible material before defending some attacks made on ours. But first, I want to talk about this participation question. We think that time is very finite, like Daniel explained. You can't expect everyone to be an expert of everything, which means that there are arguments about everyone being kind of burdened to understand all of these government functions is wrong because we are unable to be an expert of everything, especially when there are very specialized sectors that the government has to account for, i.e. things like the health industry. You need to have people who have the health and doctoral education to be able to implement the very measures that are dedicated to these kinds of sectors, or things like military weapons. You need to ensure that there are people who have expertise in military strategy before they are making major decisions about where military weapons are going. But we think that people also have to have the very important training before they get into office as proof that they have a kind of as proof that they are accountable to the very ethics and education that are necessary for those jobs in the first place. But we're going and if there's like political apathy happening now, we think that this will only continue their political apathy when they are in office. There is no reason and no incentive as to why political apathy is suddenly going to stop when they are now in office. That also turns their arguments about things like political participation, because then it creates because then there are going to be people who are less incentivized to actually be active in politics, to be actually researching things like specific politicians who are being elected into office or who are being represented when it is just randomly selected. That also means that we get a worse government when there are people who are just untrained in that. That specifically clashes with our second piece of positive material about expertise. We think that it is very important and that it does matter despite what the government says. It is not just single issue votings, but it is specific offices that have a lot of expertise and nuance that random people will simply not be able to understand with the finite amount of time that they have to get into office into the first place. They did not define what things like selection means, which means you default to our definition that this appointment is random too. Any type of argument that they make that they will be able to choose the kind of office that they're going into is counterintuitive to all of their cases. But I think I sense some disagreement.
Okay, the current question is not representative of the experts of the military, right? So they're representative of the average person who have a general on the board knowledge, right? Please engage us.
Sure, we think that the general population is still able to engage in politics in the status quo and in representative systems. But we think that the general public is unsuited for things like very specific industries. I don't want to have somebody who has never been in a high school biology class to be suddenly making decisions about vaccination or things like health mandates. I don't want somebody who has never known anything about nuclear weapons to decide where the nuclear plants are going. This is the kind of specificity and expertise that we think that you are misrepresenting here. But those kinds of like specific offices and what that means in terms of like the appointment definitions too also turns their case because they are selecting. That it's not democratic and they have taken the full decision of making who goes into which office into a couple of people's hands. Next, I want to talk about this argument about desire and about desire. We think that the government doesn't have desire and accountability. We think that the government side doesn't have an incentive. It's just based on it's just simply based on interest on who is interested in particular seats of government. We also think that there's still going to be incentive to have re-election, which means that defining there's still going to be the politician's incentive is re-election, not just election itself, which means that they're going to be held accountable by the people, held accountable by their votes, and held accountable by the kinds of things that they do in office to ensure that people continue to re-elect them. Even in the worst case scenario, people are still, regardless of what their intentions are to be in office, they are still held accountable to that. Secondly, people are still people generally are still checkbacks when you have these kinds of voting systems to make sure that they're electing somebody with expertise. Go ahead.
So politicians are paid drastically larger than ordinary citizens. Therefore, politicians lose incentive to respect and manifest their lives in this time of election. Please engage our characterization of politicians.
Sure. One, you didn't define what the House was. Daniel said in the first speech, the House can be any government. We don't think that this kind of like monetary misbalance happens in all of these countries. For instance, in the US, there are politicians who don't necessarily make more than the average citizen. But we still think that even if there is some kind of monetary incentive, these politicians are going to actively make the choices to continue to be reelected, which means that they're going to have to be held accountable regardless of the people who are electing them in the first place. That makes the natural checkbacks and natural incentives of things like elections that you don't get through random selection. In fact, under random selection, that only creates more of a political apathy, the kind of stuff that I was talking about earlier, when there are just when there are no people that can kind of check back and determine this person did their job wrong and did their job bad, but it's okay because it'll just be randomly selected the next time. We think that is a specifically bad model of government and a bad model of politics when you are unable to decide and unable to have those accountability measures to determine is this person doing their job correctly and is this person having the interests of the entire people at hand. You don't have those kinds of incentives under the government's model. Finally, we think that there's still going to be representation under the opposition side. When you have things like elections, they're still going to have people's voices and have people's interest in politics in the government. We think that this notion that there's just going to be like continuous political apathy under this current system is not necessarily true. We also think that this kind of falsifies the argument of things like choice. If people are kind of like apathetic to politics and they decide to invest themselves into an alternative form of politics, we think that that is something that the person has a choice to do rather than having a person who is politically apathetical suddenly be in a form of government. As long as the team government side is always arguing for somebody who has lack of expertise, a lack of knowledge in very important sectors, we think that they are doing all of our lives into very clumsy hands. So gratitude. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for your speech. Now, constructive speeches are over. Then move on to the summary speech from the opposition bench. So, no new argument will be made in this reply speech from opposition and government. We're proud to call on the leader of opposition reply speech within 4 minutes. Together.
The opposition proudly stand against the idea of selecting politicians at random from currently eligible adults. In this speech, I'm going to reintroduce the framework that we provided you in my first speech and tell you why that independently wins us the round because it affects how you decide which arguments are important. I'm then going to extend our points of positive matter, do a little bit of rebuttal, and finish with some crystallizing questions to help you decide who wins this round. So, first on our framework argument. We tell you that you should prioritize the performance of a politician as an impact to evaluate the round. Coming out of the government speeches, I'm still unsure how you should evaluate democracy, access, and participation, and why these things matter. We tell you, based off of desire and based off expertise, what does that get to? It gets to performance. Do you do the job well? And that is the most important thing. We told you that your role as a judge is to adopt a framework of consequentials, and they have not provided a counter model, which means you should default to that. So you're looking at the motion and you're thinking, what is the result of this? Imagine a world if this actually took place and think about it, what it would be like for the people that are living through it. And because of that, we're going to prove why selecting politicians at random hurts the performance and harms those citizens the most. So our first point of positive matter was about desire, and our second was expertise, but they go hand in hand. We gave you countless examples of doctors, firemen, people that study about the environment for a really long time. The point is these people have expertise and they want to do it. The desire is important because it motivates you to learn beforehand and afterwards. Once these people arrive to the job, if they're randomly selected, you should not expect them to try very hard because they didn't even want to be there. And I compared it to a child receiving a chore from their parents. Expertise. These are really important issues that politicians are in charge of. Nuclear policy, energy policy, the economy. These are things that you can't just randomly put people in and expect them to excel at. If we take the case of Japan, right, they just elected Ueda to be nominated the new Bank of Japan chief. Ask yourself, who should be running the central bank? Who should dictate monetary policy? Who should decide what the interest rates are? If these are things that you yourself don't know the answer to, you should not expect a randomly selected person to have the answer to it. The point is, you want an expert with decades of education and experience over someone who just got the job and is now Googling what is supply and demand. So, because of these reasons, we tell you that random selection is not going to work. These people are not going to want to do it, and they're not going to be good at it because they just don't have the knowledge. And you simply can't compete with decades of experience, knowledge, and learning. Now, into some points of rebuttal on their most important arguments. They brought up, accessibility and participation in politics. I think Nine does a really good job rebutting this, telling you that you still have political apathy because there's no consequences for performing poorly at this job. Just because you could be randomly selected doesn't mean that you're really going to want to be good at it. They also haven't addressed our timing argument, that there's no way everyone can possibly prepare for every job that they could have, and they're not going to be passionate about doing everything. So that simply wouldn't work. In terms of accessibility, we would tell you that it's not mutually exclusive. You would much rather have a politician from a minority group advocating for that group because they have expertise, they know how to effectively work the government, as opposed to randomly selecting someone and hoping that they do that. So in this round, I wanted to look back at it, think, what would happen if tomorrow all of our politicians were no longer experts, they were random people that were deciding what we should do with our nukes, how we should run the economy. Don't just think of concepts like democracy and access as principles. We want you to take a consequentialist, materialist approach to this and ask yourself, what is best for the country? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your speech. Now, I welcome the last speaker of this debate, the Prime Minister Prize in Homes. Yeah.
Three issues. First is expertise, second is participation, and lastly, accountability. The unique engagement to member of the opposition is going to be included in the service. So let's talk about the first case, equity. There are three responses, three issues to summarize. First, let's assess the harm of the opposition breaches. Leader of the opposition talked about lots of policy which is unable to be done by ordinary citizens. and the consequence made by leader of the opposition was environmental destruction and etc. and etc. First, the premise in the opposition bench is citizens deserve environmental destruction. Citizens deserve lack of security, national security. I don't think so. If citizens have massive incentive to keep the environment, we think the policy is going to be eco-friendly. If people decide that peacefully society, the national security is going to be improved. I don't understand why citizens have such an incompetent characteristic from the opposition bench to begin with. In that side of the house, I already talked about educational institution is going to be changed. I already explained narrative in the opposition bench is the right to vote, and system we support is obligation to be a politician. I think that this change is uniquely important because every people are eligible to be elected as a politician, which directly incentivizes these people to learn a lot in the school curriculum. And social narrative pushes this individual to learn and to be informed that what's going on in the society. Therefore, I think the first characterization of the harm of environmental destruction is unlikely important even if we adopt the metric of the utilitarianistic calculus, then aligns. Second, even if we agree that to a certain extent citizen is not that incompetent, we don't think that this is not a job. We don't think that this is a job of politicians to begin with. I already answered in my point of information that this expertise should be done by experts, and my partner rebutted to this point by saying that this politician can ask expertise. This politician can ask expertise, and this politician, the job is going to be done by bureaucrats. I don't understand why expertise to what extent necessary from the opposition. Lastly, many of the opposition talked about high school graduates are not that competent to solve the issue of economy or education or international relations. First, this is the biased characterization to begin with. That's the thing is done by politicians by saying that poor people are not understanding the good point of this policy. Therefore, poor people shouldn't opt into the political dispute. That's what we are problematizing in this debate to begin with. On the other hand, poor people are going to be elected as politicians. These people can claim that significant taxation policy, which is unfamiliar to these poor people, which is unfamiliar to significant tax on the poor people. We think that characterization is is biased, and this shouldn't be acceptable to begin with. Politician is also stupid to begin with. For example, one of the Japanese environmental administration says that I don't think Japan will keep going on this way. Therefore, I don't think Japan will keep going on this way. This is the very familiar analysis of the Koizumi Shinjiro, some of the politicians in Japan. Therefore, expertise is unlikely necessary to begin with. Secondly, participation. The claim from the opposition bench was simple. Political apathy will continue even in outside the past. Therefore, the political apathy is not going to be solved. I already explained the political apathy will not only be a good solution, but we can change the system with educational institution. Therefore, these people is going to recognize that I will be elected as a politician. Therefore, I'm incentivized to learn a lot. This is not happening in the style of opposition because all people believe that if I want to go voting, therefore, if I want to go voting, then you are going to vote. Therefore, I don't think that all people's opinion reflection is failing under opposition bench. I have no time to explain or summarize the point of accountability, but I think it's enough that we'd like to propose.
Yeah, thank you very much for your speech. All speech is over. So thank you very much for all debaters from the opposition. So, okay, shake hands. And move on to the comment by Dr. Yuki. So, can I ask your comments around 7 minutes, just like a speech because of the time constraints? Sure.
I don't even think I need. I'm not even sure I need 7. Really, I think this is kind of a straightforward debate, but I guess I am long-winded, so there you go. The way I see this debate is it comes down to only a few issues, but I do want to make a few observations first of some things that happened before I get to those specific issues. First observation is there was a difference in the definitions in this debate. I don't know if you paid attention to it or if you caught it or if frankly it even mattered by the end of the debate. But originally we had the government say that in their framing of the debate that an independent organization will select these politicians. Then we heard the opposition say, hey, I'm going to redefine the debate. They actually kind of misspoke because they said the government didn't define this, so they were going to define it. And the way the opposition defined it, they specifically said, we're going to say this house means the government selects. So right there was a clash of a difference of interpretation of the motion, with the government saying, no, we're going to have an independent organization make the selection of these politicians, and the opposition saying, no, the government is actually going to select the politicians, which means the government's going to select themselves. Ultimately, I'm not sure this became a point of clash or contestation in the debate itself, but I thought it was an interesting issue that could have been a bigger issue within the debate. Second sort of extraneous observation is that the debate, really the underlying debate was about whether or not, on one hand, you should go with the government proposition side and say that no, these people should be selected in compared to what the opposition was advocating, which is for people to be voted in. We probably could have heard a few more warrants explicitly on this comparative, I think, in terms of why is it really better to have them selected in, specifically juxtaposing that to people participating in voting them in as you would want for a democracy. I mean, if they're being selected in, whether it's a government, whether it's a government or third-party organization, is that really democracy? Is that really the type of government we want to create? Don't really think that was a big part of the debate either. So that it should resolve sort of the question of who won the debate, but I think those are two important things to think about. So what was the debate about? What were the issues that were point of contestation? First issue, I think, was the debate was about apathy or participation. In other words, the government team says that, listen, by adopting this model, we're going to increase political participation. Right now, in the status quo, apathy is a problem. Apathy is running rampant. This is due in part to the fact that there's a one-party rule, for example. This is the case in Japan, and we think the social discourse is going to completely change when you adopt this model, and then that's going to kill apathy. We think that's unique good on our side of the house, compared to, but that doesn't really answer the question that we'll get to in a minute is, why is that important? In other words, what's the impact of that? Do we really care? Do you really care about that apathy? Did they convince you that the increasing political participation was a sufficient good to justify the adoption of the model? That's a question I think for you to answer. Now, it's not lost upon me that there was an argument that the government had in their original speech about sort of the misrepresentation argument and how the vote seeking is bad. In other words, the fact that the status quo is very dependent on politicians and people who are only care about seeking votes and problems associated with big corporation and media control. Ultimately, I'm not sure that that point is still in the debate by the end. It sort of kind of fell out of the discussion a little bit as the discussion tended to focus on this apathy. And the second issue that I think we need to think about, which is, do we really need the expert or not? Do we need expert politicians making these decisions in office, or is it okay for us to have regular laypersons? I think this ultimately became the heart of the debate. I think the government team kind of recognized that by the end, this was kind of the heart of the debate, even though this was really led by an opposition argument that introduced us in. Notice this was their first issue that they identified in their last speech of the debate, kind of signifying that they recognized how important an issue it was in the debate. And on this issue, the opposition is essentially telling us, we think we need expert politicians because they need the education that is necessary to make these serious, important decisions, and the consequences of them not having of the type of expertise, training that we think is necessary, because it's potentially catastrophic. And there's no way that they're gonna have enough time. There's no way that everyone, in fact, in the citizenry can acquire the type of education and information that you need. By the end of the debate, we heard the government team juxtaposing this idea with the notion that, well, we don't think that expertise is needed, but even if it is needed, we think they can rely on other experts. They don't need to have the expertise necessarily themselves. Even if they can't acquire it, they can just rely on people who have acquired it. And we think that's good enough. We don't think we need expert politicians in these positions making decisions. Now, which side were you persuaded of? Do we need the experts? Do we not? I won't tell you how I would have voted. I'm just giving you some things to think about so you can decide your vote. And that's my time.